guys all the time.
We are family.
Outstanding effort again.
We're busting ours to kick yours.
That's big time.
-15.
Respect all, fear none.
Oh, did he belt that one?
Intensity is not a perfume.
It was a no-doubter.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
We are up in the bird's nest here at Oriole Park at Camden Yards. I'm Brendan Mortensen alongside Annie Klaff, coming at you a little bit later in the day on this lovely Wednesday because our producer Amy Jennings now knows how to save a life. So I think that was worth coming at you 3 hours later than our usual time. Shout out Amy.
Are you going to explain how, or you're just
No, she just knows how to now.
CPR certified? Congrats, Amy.
Woo!
Now there's one of us in the trio here that can officially save.
I like how going into this show, Amy texted us and was like, hey, can we push the podcast back? Like, I really want to go get CPR training. And then our reaction was just, sure, we can push it back and not maybe we should know how to do that.
Yeah. We used the extra time to prep for today, it was needed, apparently, because...
I guess so. Because it was more important than, I don't know, life-saving information, life-saving skills, I guess.
Hey, I've been CPR certified before, so I think it's all down to you now.
It is down to me, and I failed. My bad. That's on me.
Never go to Brendan
if
you see him on the side of the street.
Well, that's good, though. At
struggling.
least Amy is not the only one who is CPR certified, because if she went down, at least you would be good to go.
I think my certification has expired.
Well,
but
I think the knowledge is probably more important than the certification.
Very true.
Yeah.
Very true.
You always have that knowledge. And isn't that lovely? Anywho, we've got a lot of Orioles baseball to talk about today. Today is J15, which means that international prospects are going to be signing across baseball. And we know that the Orioles have made a big push over recent years to be a lot more active on the international market, led by Kobe Perez. They've got the new academy in the Dominican Republic. A lot of exciting developments there. So there is news trickling in about guys that the Orioles have been looking at throughout this international process and will potentially sign starting today. So we don't have any of the specifics on those guys who have signed yet. Nothing official on the Orioles side. So we will wait to see what happens with that international crop of talent, but exciting in general to see the Orioles more involved on that side of things because there are a lot of good teams around baseball that are built through the international market.
Yeah, of course, and almost half of the O's top 30 prospects right now have come from international markets and signed on January 15th in years past, so definitely an exciting day for those who are playing internationally and for the development system for the Orioles farm in general because it is a huge bulk of the talent that's coming in to this farm system over the last few years. Samuel Basayo is the prime example and kind of leads that force for these other international guys. So definitely exciting stuff. The way it works is could be some agreements for these players in the clubs, but nothing is official until they go pen to paper. So definitely going to be some news throughout the day and wherever Roki Sasaki ends up as well. So it could be an exciting end to Wednesday, January 15th.
Yeah, absolutely. And make sure you are tuned in to MASNsports.com, all of our MASN Orioles social pages. We will have you covered whenever that news is official. And over the next few days, hopefully we'll get to hear from some of the guys who have signed and get to hear about what this new international class is looking like. But Andy, we've got a lot to talk about today with the Orioles potentially going with a 6-man rotation to open up the season. We're going to talk about whether or not that is a route that Baltimore should or could go to open up the year. But first, we've got another signing to talk about, and that is some bullpen help in the form of Andrew Kittredge. 35-year-old right-hander, was really good last year. 74 games, a 2.80 ERA, whip just over 1,100. Another kind of interesting case with how his career has gone. Started off a little slow, started as a starting pitcher and was just not really effective in that role. But since 2021, it's a 2.48 ERA in 162 games. He's got a 3.26 career ERA as a reliever. He's not going to come in and close games, but he is a good high-leverage reliever to add to the back end of this bullpen.
Yeah, and you mentioned the 74 appearances with the Cardinals last season, which is huge, especially as he goes into 35 years old this March. So you'd question that age a little bit, but having come out and recovered from a Tommy John surgery and posting 74 appearances in the 2 years after that is huge. And to have that
bullpen
comeback.
arms can really, like, it's not a outfielder that's 35 years old. Like a bullpen arm, you can pitch well into your mid to late 30s.
Definitely. But what I like for Kittredge as well is a 1.20 ERA in the month of September last season, which is huge as well, just to kind of have that prolonged strength throughout the season, especially kind of in a 35-year-old, to have that in September. It was almost his best month of last season in that September. So I really like that. Also really like the chase rate of 38.9%, which is the 100th percentile.
That's the best.
Highest
That's the best percentile you can have.
Exactly. Highest among all righty relievers last season. So that is going to be really, really crucial to add to this Orioles bullpen.
Yeah, and you mentioned the injury with Tommy John. He missed a large chunk of 2022 and a majority of 2023. Only pitched in 17 games in that 2022 season. Goes down with Tommy John. Pitches at the tail end of 2023. So I think going into 2024, there were some question marks about what kind of pitcher he would be when he came back. I think he answered all of those questions last year in St. Louis. As I mentioned, only 16 career saves, so he doesn't figure to be anybody in a closing conversation. Obviously, Felix Bautista is back for 2025, and that is huge for the Orioles. I will be curious to see if Felix is thrown right back into that closer role right away, or if they ease him back into things a little bit. Maybe we see some Sir Anthony Dominguez, some Gregory Soto before Felix is, completely ready to go, ramped back up to that closing role. Who knows? Maybe after missing the entirety of last season and being a full go for spring training, hopefully Felix might be ready to take over that closing spot. But if there is a conversation to be had there, I don't think Kittredge really fits into it all that much. But this is a high leverage guy. He has a 751 OPS allowed in innings 4 through 6 in his career, and then improves to a 665 OPS allowed in innings 7 through 9. A 692 OPS allowed in high leverage situations, a 785 OPS allowed in low leverage situations. So that says to me that he's kind of got the pulse of a reliever, which is he likes coming in during high leverage spots late in the game, and that's important to add to this bullpen. Just somebody who is comfortable in those sorts of roles. The Orioles have a lot of guys that can be there in that 7th, 8th inning role. I think they have some guys that are a little bit streaky in those roles as well. Sir Anthony Dominguez, Gregory Soto, Cionel Perez are the kinds of relievers that we have seen in the past will have, a month or two where they are unhittable and then maybe have a few week stretch where things are a little bit off. So to have somebody like Kittredge who is a little bit more consistent and is comfortable in those high leverage situations, I think it adds a lot to this bullpen to add another veteran there.
And it's also different from last year when you signed Craig Kimbrell to a 1-year deal, where you had someone that was streaky throughout the season. And with Kittredge, it's definitely going to be different because you kind of know what you're going to get from a guy who's used to being put into high leverage situations like you mentioned. I want to talk about his slider a little bit, which has it's his most used pitch out of his pitch mix. It accounts for almost half of his pitch mix. It has a 41.3% whiff rate, according to Fangraphs, and allowed a 177 batting average against that slider in 2024, which is better than his expected batting average against that as well. So I think that is going to be something really exciting that we're going to see from him in 2025. I mean, righties hit 120 against that slider this year, which is actually insane.
Yeah.
And then he also did start to use his four-seamer was kind of that second most used pitch out of that pitch mix, but it increases from month to month, which is interesting. He doesn't use it all that often in the beginning of the season, but towards the end, last year especially, it definitely increased, which will throw off hitters more towards the end of the season, especially if they're expecting that slider.
Yeah, 100%, 100th percentile chase rate, as you mentioned, and the slider is a really big part of that. That's really, really good.
Yeah.
So Kittredge is an exciting addition to this bullpen. You're right. It's also different from Craig Kimbrell, where you're not asking him to come in and be the savior of this bullpen. It's just another really solid piece to add on. And having so many good pieces, I mean, this bullpen is pretty stacked right now.
Yeah.
Obviously, if Felix is back to full strength, that is one of the best relievers in baseball. And there's not a ton of guys that are, a top 10 reliever type of baseball, pitcher in this bullpen outside of Felix, but you're just adding a lot of really, really solid options. Kittredge, Dominguez, Soto. I mean, Keegan Aiken was really solid last year. Perez has been really solid for stretches. So there are a lot of names in that bullpen that just feel really trustworthy. And another thing to add about Kittredge as well, he's really good coming off a little bit more rest in his career. He's got a 2.18 ERA after 3 days of rest, a 3.05 ERA after 2 days of rest, and a 3.80 ERA after 1 day of rest. So having a really solid bullpen that has a lot of depth and has a lot of guys that you can shuffle through, it's going to help Kittredge, because the more rest that he has between appearances, the better he has been.
And depth is certainly kind of the name of the game now because of all that you've brought in for this starting rotation as well. You have guys that like Cade Povich or Trevor Rogers who kind of could potentially help out in that bullpen as well. But if you look at it right now, you have on the right-handed side of things, it's Felix Bautista, Andrew Kittredge, Yennier Cano, Seranthony Dominguez, maybe Albert Suarez, if I'm assuming he'll play more into that kind of bullpen role now. And then lefties, Keegan Aiken, Gregory Soto, and Cionel Perez. I know we talked a little bit earlier in the offseason of, okay, one of our top needs for the O's to check off a box in this offseason is to get a lefty bullpen arm, especially when you lose Danny Coulombe. But I think that with the lefties you have now in Keegan Aiken, Gregory Soto, Cionel Perez, if you bring Cade Povich down as well, I think you do have that really solid depth regardless of having Kittredge as another right-hander. So I don't think that is a downfall that he's righty instead of lefty. I think you bring it in depth regardless. So I think it'll be good to have him either way.
Yeah, and I think you have enough solid lefties in the bullpen that yes, getting a lefty reliever would have made the numbers look nice where you have 4 lefties and 4 righties, but it wasn't 100% necessary to bring in just a pure, left-handed bullpen arm. You just needed a good bullpen arm. We were just getting specific with, what we thought the Orioles' needs could be. But I think in general, you mentioned the needs that we pointed out for the Orioles going into the offseason. They have checked a lot of boxes up to this point, and I think that's important to note because the thing that's going to get magnified is the top end of the starting rotation, which is understandable. You had Corbin Burns last year, and you add Morton, you add Sugano, and those guys don't have the upside of a Corbin Burns, so naturally a lot of the question marks about this offseason are going to be about a high-end starting pitcher. I think you and I both had that as the number one need for the Orioles going into the offseason. But they have still done a lot of things that they needed to do. Power hitting outfielder in Tyler O'Neill. Backup catcher in Gary Sanchez. Pitching depth, as I mentioned, in Charlie Morton and Tomoyuki Sugano. And now bullpen help in Andrew Kittredge. That's still checking a lot of the boxes that you need to check. And I understand that, maybe you were going into this offseason, like I said, with the hopes of getting a high-end starting pitcher, of bringing in somebody on a huge deal. That could still happen if you make a trade for somebody like Dylan Cease or Luis Castillo, whatever it may be. But you have done so many other good things to make this team better that it's easier to magnify the one thing. But the Orioles have done so many good things. You're currently top 10 in baseball in free agent spending value, according to SpotTrack. Yes, again, that one big need is still there, but you've done a lot of good things.
Yeah, and I do want to point out that spending as well because fans will be very quick to feel disappointed with the moves that they've made so far because none of them have really been that big splash, kind of what you were hoping for. Nothing of a Corbin Burns caliber.
I think Tyler O'Neill signing is still a relatively large splash, but yes, you're not handing out a $200 million deal for Corbin Burns.
But to go from where the Orioles have been historically in terms of spending in the very much lower half of all MLB clubs in spending in the offseason to where they are 10th, I think you said, that's $63 million worth of spending for just free agents. Yeah. And there's more as well for arbitration eligible players that we saw recently in the last week or so. The spending is a huge contributor to a difference from this ownership this year to years past because yes, you can talk about the Orioles being cheap, but I don't think that's the case. They're literally just being smart with it and strategic with their money. We also don't know if they're done. Like you said, it could be a trade piece, a Dylan Cease, a Luis Castillo, and all of these other moves that were one-year deals could all be kind of a part of a bigger plan that we just don't know yet.
Yeah.
So I think the $63 million of spending in free agents is still really something to hold on to when you think about this offseason compared to previous ones.
Yeah, and again, I would certainly not call top 10 in spending in baseball in this offseason cheap by any stretch of the imagination. So the Orioles are going out, they are making moves, they are making the team better in a lot of different ways, and they are going to continue to do so. It's funny, real quick, to go back to the beginning of our show here, we mentioned that it was J15. The Orioles had not made any signings official. The Orioles now have announced that they have signed 22 players in their international signing class as of about 5 minutes ago. This is the beauty of live podcasting. The highlight of the class, by many, at least by rankings, is Jose Luis Pena, 16 years old from the Dominican Republic. He is ranked as the number 42 international prospect by Baseball America and number 47 by MLB Pipeline. The scouting report says he has a chance to be a solid everyday type of player with a plus hit and power combo, projects to be at shortstop long-term defensively. Large frame, athletic build. That's what you're looking for in a 16, 17-year-old kid that is getting signed. Does he have, the type of athletic build that he can grow into? Are the movements fluid at shortstop or whatever other position he's playing? Is there power upside there? That's really what you're going to be looking for. And with this class, I don't think you need to pay too close attention to the rankings. The Orioles in general, as we have talked about with international signings in the past, they are still really filling out this system. And so you wouldn't look for the Orioles to go out and sign the biggest name international free agent on the market. You would look for them to fill out the system by adding 22 players. Like, this is what we are looking for as the Orioles are still building up the academy. They are still building up what this international farm system looks like. So, and you also don't know, how these kids are going to develop.
Yeah.
Samuel Basallo was not even given the largest signing bonus from the Orioles in their own international class. That was Michael Hernandez when the Orioles signed Samuel Basallo, and Basallo turns into a top 10 prospect in baseball. So it's all about getting them in the building, getting them in the facilities, and seeing how you can develop them to hopefully bud into, a future star type of player like Samuel Basallo is. So yes, you can read the scouting reports and you can see where all of these guys are ranked and all of those things, but it's really going to be about the development and getting them in the building and trying to mold them into the type of player that they can be.
Yeah, that's really important to note, that because it is so much more difficult to scout these types of players when it's a very, very different system abroad as compared to if you're, just going through scouting for the MLB draft, where you have guys in high school with clear stats that you can look at, or college stats as well. So it's definitely very, very much more difficult to be very precise and predict very closely on how these international players are going to kind of come into fruition in the U.S. But I think you're right. They've been making moves over the years and in this Elias era to really build up this international kind of system and the farm system as a whole. And I think it's all going to pay off the way you said, by filling it out more and just kind of putting lots of stokes in the fire. Yeah,
Mike Elias gets a lot of credit for how he has drafted and the kind of team that the Orioles have built here. Kobe Perez deserves a ton of credit, and Mike Elias obviously deserves the credit for bringing Perez, into this organization as well. But Kobe Perez deserves a ton of credit for just how quickly the Orioles have turned around their activity on the international market, because the Orioles were not players internationally for a long time. And Kobe Perez comes in, pretty much overhauls this entire system. And now, again, you're seeing a ton of prospects in the top 30, as you mentioned, that are internationally signed. Samuel Basallo is one of the best prospects in all of baseball. So this farm system turnaround, yes, it has been about the drafting, but it has also been in large part due to the turnaround of the international system, which is really, really great to see that the Orioles are getting involved everywhere. So, all right, we've jumped around a little bit, but let's get back to the meat and potatoes of the show, which was if the Orioles should consider going to a 6-man rotation. Because right now, when you are looking at the guys that figure to be in your top 5, you've got Zach Eflin, Grayson Rodriguez, Dean Kramer, Charlie Morton, and Tomoyuki Sugano. All of those guys are right-handed. Zach Eflin, Grayson Rodriguez, and Dean Kramer all spent time on the injured list last year, and Sugano has spent his entire career pitching on a once-a-week schedule with 5 days of rest. And I think there are a lot of merits to it. I think there are also arguments against it where, veterans in Major League Baseball, guys like Charlie Morton and Zach Eflin, are used to pitching on 4 days of rest in a typical 5-man rotation. But we have seen around baseball over the last few years, the Orioles had it for a while last year. They had a 6-man rotation. We have seen this become more of a trend around baseball, that pitchers are getting 5 days of rest rather than 4. And yes, I see the comments on Facebook that pitchers are only going 4 or 5 innings and they don't need more rest. Pitchers are also getting injured more than ever due to, whatever factors there may be. There are plenty of articles and theories out there about why pitchers are getting hurt more often, whether it starts at the youth level and moving all the way up. Pitchers are throwing harder. They're spinning the ball faster, whatever it may be. I think there are a lot of pros and cons to it. I think the Orioles have the talent to make it a 6-man rotation if they wanted to.
100%, and especially when you bring in guys like Sugano and Morton to be able to have that depth, you are way better off with those two than you were last year without them.
Yeah.
Because you have that depth and you have that flexibility to move to a 6-man rotation, because you also have really strong depth in guys like Cade Povich, Trevor Rogers, and Chase McDermott, who could potentially even come into that rotation as well, should there be a need. And another injury, like you said, pitching injuries are way more common than they used to be. Their teams are pitching more games in general than they used to be in years past. So I think it definitely could be a pro, especially when you kind of look at the way it could shift, because if you start with a 6-man rotation, who knows when you get Kyle Bradish back, if he comes back to the full potential that he can be, maybe you shift that back to a 5-man and you have confidence. Or even if you develop Grayson Rodriguez into an ace type, which I think we all know he can be, and he has that potential as well, it can be a shift throughout the season of how is the personnel doing, how's the health, how kind of what changes and tasks do you need to delegate to each of these guys. So I don't think it's an end-all, be-all. You start the season with a 6-man rotation. That's it. You're not going to the postseason. It's way different than that, because it could take you to the postseason, and then you change when you get Kyle Bradish or Tyler Wells back. Who knows?
Yeah, let's talk about some of the pros and cons. We can start with the cons. Let's go there. We'll start with the negative. We'll go to the positive. I think the most obvious con of a 6-man rotation is that you don't have your top guys pitching as frequently. If Grayson Rodriguez comes out next year and looks like an absolute ace, you want Grayson Rodriguez to be pitching in as many games as possible. And if you went to a 6-man rotation, Grayson Rodriguez would have an extra day of rest, which means that is one more game that Grayson Rodriguez is not pitching. I don't know the exact figures for how many starts that would knock off for an entire season if they went the entire season with a 6-man rotation. But let's say, you start the season with a 6-man, you go to a 5 for a little bit with an injury maybe or something like that. You go back to a 6 here and there. Maybe Grayson Rodriguez starts 4, 5, 6 fewer games in a 6-man rotation than he would have with a 5-man rotation. So that is one obvious con. I think another one is that you don't want to, on the flip side of Grayson Rodriguez isn't pitching as frequently, you're also having the guys that you're at the bottom of the rotation pitching more frequently, right? That is how a 6-man would work, because whoever would be the 6th guy is probably your starting pitcher who is on the fringe of the rotation, and, maybe he was a bullpen piece, and maybe he was this, and maybe he was that. And now all of a sudden he is a consistent starting pitcher. And do you necessarily want that guy in the rotation, or do you want to just keep it at your 5 most talented guys? And yes, again, I see the comments talking about, they're only going 4 or 5 innings at a time. Why do they need rest? Yeah, maybe they should be getting out there every 5th day. Maybe it is a routine sort of thing, which is another con. As I mentioned, maybe somebody like Charlie Morton or Zach Eflin, who has been in the big leagues for a really long time, is just used to a 5-man rotation. They are used to their routines. They are used to getting their body ready to go after 4 days of rest. And maybe while it sounds like an extra day of rest might be great for a veteran pitcher, maybe they're just used to their routines. And, I'm sure all of these guys wouldn't pound their fists on the table and say, no, we can't do a 6-man rotation if the team believes that will help them. But, there are certainly starting pitchers out there that I would imagine wouldn't be super pumped about switching to a different routine when they have been doing the same thing for, 8-9 years out of their big league career.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that those are the 3 biggest cons to going with a 6-man rotation, and you never really know. I think it's hard to tell in the offseason because it isn't February yet. We still have lots of time left to see a potential move to solidify if the O's are going to go with a 5-man or 6-man rotation. But you're right, if you are looking at it, if the season were to start tomorrow and you have who you have right now, I think you could work with a 6-man rotation because of the status of the pitchers right now. You don't necessarily have that true ace. And like you mentioned, a con is, sure, you don't have your true ace, which is fine. And I think that some of the guys like Zach Eflin, Grayson Rodriguez could eventually be that true ace type of guy. Maybe not right now is what we're talking about. And that's kind of the whole point of us having this conversation of a 6-man rotation. So that definitely is a con for it, but I think it also is a pro when you kind of need to make that move and have other guys with the most depth that you can kind of get, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are plenty of guys that could work into this rotation conversation. So let's go to the pro side of things, right? I think the first thing you look at is the fact that, yes, you have those 5 guys, and then it naturally raises some questions of, okay, well, Cade Povich showed some really good flashes last year. And Trevor Rogers, you dealt for him at the deadline. You've got him in the building. Hopefully there are some good offseason progressions there to get Trevor Rogers to a place where he could be in the starting rotation. This was an all-star and one of the best young pitchers in baseball a few years ago. Do you feel confident that he's back to a good spot and you want to see what you have out of him? Albert Suarez was really solid in a lot of starts last year. Chase McDermott is one of your best pitching prospects. Do you want to keep him at AAA? Do you want to see what you have out of him in a potential rotation? I think that's, probably the biggest pro there is that there are guys that all have their own merit. I think if I were putting money on it, I would say Povich and Rogers, I think, have the 2 best cases to potentially be in this rotation. Yeah. Cade Povich, because she showed a lot of good flashes last year, and Trevor Rogers, because you put resources into getting him. He's in the building. He's under team control for 2 more years. You want to see what you have out of him, and if he can get back to the kind of form that we saw from Trevor Rogers a few years ago. The talent is there, and I think that's probably the biggest pro there. If it is Povich and Rogers that are the leaders in the clubhouse, you also have the obvious pro of getting a lefty into the rotation, which is not as important as having a lefty in the bullpen, but it's not unimportant to have a lefty in the rotation at some point there, just for variety's sake, right? So I think those are the 2 biggest ones for me, alongside with just getting rest, like keeping these guys healthy as long as possible. I don't know if there is enough evidence with a 6-man rotation versus a 5-man rotation to definitively say that giving guys more rest keeps them from getting injured more frequently, but I can't imagine that it would hurt. I don't know. There's no evidence to say solidly one way or another that it keeps guys healthier, but just, I don't know, logically it would make sense that more rest might keep guys a little bit healthier, right? I don't know.
Yeah, and I feel like with everything that we learned last year with the rotation and all the injuries, this should seem like a decent thing that the O's have gotten this much depth to be able to feel comfortable throwing Cade Povich in or feel comfortable having Charlie Morton in there, or even Trevor Rogers, Chase McDermott, you name it. Just to have the numbers is huge comparatively to last year where we saw 3, 4, 5 guys come down with injuries. So I think that is the biggest takeaway. And to even have the numbers and amount of guys to fill a 6-man rotation is also huge because you never know what could happen come, I don't know, June with an injury or whatnot. Right. So I do think that there is still room to shift the narrative and still bring in an ace via trade or whatnot, and we won't know until the offseason is over. But I think for now you feel pretty good with the guys that you have in that rotation to fill out a 6-man.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too. The Dodgers are reportedly planning to go to a 6-man rotation next season with a lot of guys coming off of injuries, Ohtani and Glass now, but also because Ohtani and Yamamoto are used to pitching on 5 days rest. That is what they did pitching in Japan, and they are trying to make it a little bit more comfortable for the two guys that are the two best starting pitchers in their rotation. Now, Sugano comes to Baltimore and, maybe isn't the best pitcher in this starting rotation, but he has pitched a long time overseas, and he is used to pitching on longer rest. So would it make sense to bring him into a 6-man rotation where he is comfortable with the amount of rest that he would be getting? Sugano seems like a baller from, the first press conference that he had, like fired up, ready to go. So I'm sure that he would not be resistant to pitching in a 5-man rotation, and he is probably assuming that change is coming. But, maybe you make it a little bit more comfortable for him as well. And last thing on the pro side of things, last year I was having a conversation with Orioles pitching coach Drew French about Albert Suarez. It was kind of an unrelated thing, but Albert Suarez had pitched overseas. He had kind of bounced around a little bit before he came to Baltimore. And so I had asked Drew if there was any common denominator with guys that, go overseas to leagues like the KBO, Eric Fetty, Merrill Kelly, and come back to the States and have a lot of success in Major League Baseball, if there was any common factor there. And one of the things that he said was that, a lot of those leagues were, quote, more like the minor leagues where you're pitching once a week, you're getting a lot of recovery, and their ability to be the best version of themselves is probably heightened over there versus having to pitch on a 5-day schedule here.
That's interesting.
So that's the Orioles pitching coach saying that getting a little bit more rest probably allows those guys to, A, get more recovery, to B, the best versions of themselves.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if that means the Orioles would go to a 6-man rotation, and if, that was just more of an anecdotal thing from, the Orioles pitching coach Drew French on, what was leading to Suarez being successful over there, but I don't think that's an insignificant thing for the Orioles pitching coach to say and think about that sort of rest schedule for pitchers overseas.
Right, because you also want to have, say they do go to a 6-man rotation, you want to have that confidence from the pitching coach to be able to say, okay, I think that this plan works and we feel confident. We've seen the results with guys like Albert Suarez who are confident, stay healthy, and stay consistent on that kind of schedule like a 6-man rotation. And not to mention with the guys that they brought in Sugano and Charlie Morton, guys who have noticeably been consistent over the years. I mean, Charlie Morton posting 30-plus games in 6 of the last 30-plus games in 6 of the last 7 seasons is huge. So to have that kind of consistency from a guy in your rotation, whether or not you are going every 5th or 4th day, it is going to be crucial because you kind of need to know what you're going to get out of this guy. And from Sugano and Morton, you know that they're going to be able to post and what you're going to get out of them.
Yeah, and there are Morton and Sugano add to like a very solid 5-man rotation. If the Orioles open up the season with a 5-man rotation of Eflin, Rodriguez, Kramer, Morton, Sugano, you feel good about those 5 guys. I think if the Orioles make a trade for a pitcher, if they bring in, a Cease or a Castillo or somebody like that, they will almost certainly go to a 6-man rotation because I don't see any of these 5 guys in Eflin, Grayson, Kramer, Morton, Sugano going to the bullpen in any sort of role. So I think at that point you're almost certainly at a 6-man rotation, But I think as the rotation currently stands, again, we do not know if the Orioles are going to go to a 6-man rotation. This is just pointing out, that they could do it if they wanted to. I think we know a few things. The first thing is that they have done it before. They did it last year because they just kind of had to, and they went to a 6-man rotation, and it worked for them for a while. The second thing we know is that they have the talent to do it. I think there are solid cases to be made for Cade Povich, for Trevor Rogers, for Albert Suarez, for Chase McDermott to potentially be in this rotation heading into 2025. And we don't really know if there's any solid evidence to say that a 6-man rotation produces better numbers or it keeps guys healthier. There's just not a large enough sample size of this happening around baseball to really get an idea of whether or not that is better. But we do know that it is a trend. I think it was Mike Petriello of MLB.com that noted that these past few seasons have been the first where a starting pitcher getting 5 days of rest was more common than a starting pitcher getting 4 days of rest. So this is a trend around baseball. This is not just a potentially, Baltimore-only thing here going to a six-man rotation. The Dodgers are reportedly doing it going into 2025. The Red Sox might be in that boat as well with a six-man rotation. So this seems to be a trend that teams are at least trying out and seeing if it works and seeing if it keeps guys healthier or if the numbers get better. And I think over the next few seasons, this could be commonplace that you have 6 starting pitchers going every 5-6 days.
Yeah, 100%. And in that same article, there were 5 other teams listed as well that have done so recently and will likely do so in 2025 because, like I said before, the amount of innings pitched per a team in one season is way more than it used to be in years past, just given the amount of time between the postseason and the regular season and how long the postseason runs.
Postseason expansion. You might be playing more series.
So that's just kind of the status quo now is you got pitchers throwing more innings. It might be 4 or 5 innings in one game, but throughout the entire season, that's a lot more than it used to be in years past. So I think this is definitely the norm. I don't think we'll ever see all 30 teams go to a 6-man rotation.
Sure.
But I think it is definitely a trend and something that we can't really be too surprised by if it happens.
Yeah, and I think probably the most likely scenario here is that at some point during the season, the Orioles will go to a 6-man. At some point, they will probably have a 5-man. Because as you mentioned, I think once you are getting down the stretch, when you are in September, if Kyle Bradish comes back and is fully healthy and you know who your 5 guys are, you probably go to a 5-man rotation. Because in September, in crunch time, you want to see what guys have. If it's, Povich or McDermott on the prospect side, if it's, Trevor Rogers working his way back or Suarez bouncing between the bullpen and the starting rotation, whatever it may be, yes, you want to see what guys have, but when it's crunch time, you want your best starting pitchers out there as long as possible. So I think towards the end of the season, it'll probably be a 5-man rotation. Going into the playoffs, it'll probably be a 4-man rotation getting into October, but you got to get there first. And the Orioles are going to do whatever they need to do during the regular season, whether it's a 6-man rotation or a 5-man rotation, to keep these starting pitchers healthier than they were last year and hopefully just as effective and more effective than they were last year. That's going to be the entire calculus. Yes, you can make arguments for both a 6-man and a 5-man. If it keeps them healthy and they're pitching well, the Orioles are going to go that route, whichever one it may be. But we'll see. I think the Orioles have the talent to do it, and I think spring training is going to determine a lot. And we're going to be there for spring training. We're going to have coverage on all of your MASN Orioles social pages sometime in mid-February. We'll be down there for a stretch getting some, the first pop of the glove during spring training for the full workout. Whew, that's going to hit. We're less than a month away from pitchers and catchers reporting to Sarasota, and then the full squad will be there. We will be there for the first full squad workout. So that's going to be exciting. We're excited to bring you some spring training coverage here on MASN, so make sure you are staying tuned to all of our MASN Orioles social pages. We've also got some more fun podcasts coming up. We've got a fantasy draft coming up at the end of January. We're going to be joined by good friend Tim Leonard, and we are going to be doing do we have a name for it yet? A lot of names got tossed around.
I thought it was just the
Modern Era O's draft.
Yeah.
Maybe the Killer Bees draft. Anybody that played under Buck and Brandon.
Yeah.
I don't know. We're throwing out a lot of names. I thought so, right?
I like that.
But it's going to be a fantasy draft. If you have been a longtime listener to the show, first of all, thank you. Second, I don't know how you're still doing it, but I appreciate it. And third, we're going to have our fantasy draft episode as we do every offseason with an era of Orioles baseball, and we have decided that this era will be the modern era of O's baseball. So any Oriole that has been on the team from 2010 to present will be eligible to be selected. It's going to be me, Annie, and Tim. It's going to be exciting. Your first draft, Annie.
First draft.
Yeah.
Luckily, I got a few more weeks to prep.
Oh, yeah.
But it's going to be fun. Hopefully, I get a good draft pick number.
Yeah, that's always interesting
Stuck
because
in the
in
middle.
drafts past, there has been one draft pick that is just way better than the others. In years past, I think in the all Earl Weaver draft, you really wanted the first overall pick so you can get, Jim Palmer.
Yeah.
Like there was just one guy who separated himself. I think Moose was in that category for one of the drafts that we did. And then I want to say the Camden Yards draft, I think you really wanted the third pick because you could go back to back with two guys.
Yeah.
Because there was like a group of four that was way better. So we'll see. It'll be interesting, but fantasy draft, exciting.
Very excited.
I think we're going to be doing it the last week of January. So make sure you stay tuned for that very special episode. Probably be a two-parter. So a special Orioles fantasy draft. But I think that'll just about do it for this week's edition of The Bird's Nest. Big thank you to CPR certified producer Amy Jennings behind the scenes. Thank you for following along with us live. I know we were at a different time this week than normal, but you can catch us live every Wednesday, 11 a.m. on YouTube and Facebook, or after the fact on any of your favorite podcast platforms, Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts or your digital shows, you can find us here on The Bird's Nest. For Annie Klaff, I'm Brendan Mortensen, and we'll catch you next time.